The Whirlwind, yes.
Okay. Boy, you know, I have some trepidation. I'm looking at this crowd piling up and I see all sorts of real archaeologists. And I think, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? I was never
Hey,
the dig.
I'm an art historian, so you're fine.
All right. Well, I was never the digging kind of archaeologist. And
Oh, I've dug a lot, but I am an art historian.
I've dug a lot too, but I've never thought of myself as the digging kind. So, and yet here I am. And I'm hoping not to annoy people too badly, but I guess we'll see how it goes. Maybe that's my job. Anyway, so I've called the talk "Reaping the Whirlwind: Reflections on Reconciliation, Collaboration, and What Happens Next." I don't even know if the talk that I actually came up with matches the title, but I had to do the title on no notice, so it is what it is. For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, and so it shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it. Hosea 8:7. The origin of that expression, reap the whirlwind, is such an interesting one, you know. I'm sorry, I came from, one of my parents was an evangelical, and he didn't actually manage to turn me into an evangelical. He managed to turn me into almost an atheist, but who could win at Bible trivia. So anyway, Hosea was this Hebrew prophet who lived in the 8th century BC, around about the time that Israel was captured by the Assyrians. And he was worried, as many of these prophets were, that his people were straying from God's path into sin and idolatry, and that they were going to pay a hefty price for their transgressions. Not surprisingly, he's remembered as a prophet of doom. And interestingly, the only thing we know about Hosea's family life was that he was married to a woman named Gomer, who apparently was a Real Housewives of Miami level cheater, like beyond the pale. Although, to be fair, being married to a prophet of doom was probably no picnic. Those prophets had a notoriously poor work-life balance, long hours, terrible pay, and there was the constant threat of doom to be contended with, smiting and plagues and that sort of thing. Oof. Anyway, the expression "reap the whirlwind" proved so pithy and evocative that it has been appropriated by doomsayers ever since. Frederick Douglass used it to threaten Southern men behind lynch mobs in the late 19th century. It's there in all the great literature. And by great literature, I mean the sort of books that one can find at an airport kiosk that sells gum and junior mints. It's been used to great effect in comic books and in the sorts of movies where the problems of humanity can all be solved at the point of a gun. I even found it in romance novels. Although when I look at the title of this book and the image on the cover, I don't like where it's going one bit. You know, she looks like Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island, and he looks like Jeffrey Dahmer. Why is his hand on her leg? Why are his fingers so freakishly long? Why is she looking at him so adoringly when he's clearly looking at her like she's food? How can this be illustrative of lighthearted romantic escapism? Anyways, I'm off topic, sorry. The overly long point of all of this is that there are both literary and biblical precedents for the idea that we can expect to suffer serious consequences as the result of our own bad actions, that what goes around comes around. And I think archaeology is either having such a moment or is about to. Now, I'm going to start with a proposition that if there are any academic archaeologists here, is probably going to annoy them. But I'm going to start with the proposition that when we talk about archaeology in Ontario, what we're really talking about is consulting archaeology, CRM, archaeology for hire. And I know that there might be 3 or 4 academic archaeologists listening to this who are going to get upset and say, hey, we still exist. And I know you do, and please don't get upset. I don't want you to get upset because if you have a heart attack or something, your university won't replace you. So please settle down. I don't want to downplay your contribution or, heaven forbid, negate your existence, but it wouldn't be an exaggeration to suggest that for every research project conducted in Ontario, there are in excess of 1,000 consulting contracts that take place, probably much more. The last time I looked in on the ministry, there were about 3,000 CRM contracts a year being carried out under license. Licensed research projects can usually be counted on the fingers of one hand, even if your name is Frodo Baggins, if you understand what I mean. Academic archaeology may still have an important role to play, and it's worth fighting to protect it. But like vinyl records and stubby beer bottles and old growth forests, it's both venerable and not coming back. Proposition 2. I would say that there is no guiding principle at work when it comes to protecting archaeology and heritage in the province. And I know that sounds pretty stark, but if you want to do a thing, you need to have, well, some sort of goals to lay out what that thing is and how you plan to accomplish it. You know, my consulting company has a mission and vision statement. If I want to expand my line of credit or start a new line of business, I'd have to show my bank a business plan, some kind of plan, any kind of plan. But if you go to the website of the MHSTCI, which I might add is a terrible acronym since it's actually harder to say than the words that it replaces: heritage, sport, tourism, and cultural industries. You know, we use scuba because we don't want to say self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. But if its inventors had called it a thing that you wear on your back that has tubes coming out of it that helps you breathe, it would probably be just easier to say that than ATTYWOYBTHTCOOITTHYB. So anyway, if you go to the website of what from here on in I will simply call the ministry, you will find archaeology lumped in with badminton, libraries, and Ontario Wine Week. And on the ministry's jump page, which doesn't actually link to archaeology, you will find the bland assertion that the ministry protects cultural heritage resources. And if you rummage around long enough on the website, you can find the archaeology page, which provides the reader with a nice, concise list of how the ministry accomplishes its goal of protecting cultural heritage resources. The ministry enforces Part 6 of the Ontario Heritage Act. They license archaeologists. They maintain the Ontario Ontario Public Register of Archaeological Reports. They review archaeological reports. They maintain the Ontario Archaeological Sites database. They advise and support licensed archaeologists, municipalities, and approval authorities. But a list of what you do is not the same as an explanation of what you're trying to achieve. What are we protecting? Who are we protecting it for? Why are we protecting it? Why does it matter? You know, those are all pretty important questions that seem to be absent from the discussion. If archaeology is important to the people of Ontario, they certainly aren't selling it very well. If something matters, I want to know why. If I want an answer to the question, why should we protect wetlands? And all I can find is we manage dams, we fund conservation authorities, and we limit the release of effluent into rivers, I don't think I would be put at ease. If something matters, if it's a priority, then it should be sold as such, unless it's clearly not a priority. And perhaps in the case of the ministry's statement that they protect cultural heritage resources, we need to consider another biblical quote. You will know them by their fruits, sometimes translated as by their deeds ye shall know them. So let's take a look at how the ministry protects, I'm using air quotes now, cultural heritage resources. Now, some folks, again, I'm speaking to non-archaeologists at the moment, but some folks are under the impression that the Ontario Heritage Act, or the OHA, is why we have archaeological consulting in the province. But that's not exactly true. The OHA became law in 1975, but it's not actually the legislation that triggers archaeological work. The Heritage Act sets out the archaeological licensing regime in the province. It provides some theoretical protections for registered archaeological sites, but most of the archaeology that's carried out in the province is triggered by the Planning Act and a few other bits of legislation, all of which are informed by the PPS, the Provincial Policy Statement. Now, the first one of those came out in 1983, and they've been released every 5 years, every 5 years or so since then. The province uses the PPS to identify its planning priorities for housing, infrastructure, heritage, the environment, transportation, energy, water, waste disposal, mineral extraction, the whole shebang. And then it lays out the rules for how those priorities should be carried out. Now, these policy statements are aspirational documents. They don't carry the force of law per se, but it is expected that any new legislation and regulations will conform to both their spirit and their intent. And the first PPS made it clear that development projects should not be undertaken until lands to be impacted were subject to archaeological assessment. And since 1983, the requirements for archaeology have been tweaked, improved, and tightened up with almost every release of a new PPS. The most recent document, called PPS 2020, because it came out in 2020, states in section 2.6.2, development and site alteration shall not be permitted on lands containing archaeological resources or areas of archaeological potential unless significant archaeological resources have been conserved. But what does conserved actually mean? The ministry says they, quote, protect, unquote, cultural heritage resources. Now, if I want to save something, I might use the term preserve. Conserve, on the other hand, conserve. Sounds like what I do when I eat a bag of gummy bears and save all the orange ones, which are factually the best ones, for last. I conserve them, but there's still none left when I'm done. Conserve. It has this whiff of being a bland technical term that might not mean anything good. You know, is it a euphemism? Is it like saying passed away instead of died horribly? Or is it bureaucratic speak, exaggeration? You know, is it like the cheese you get with your nachos at the movie theater, where cheese has to be in quotes because it turns out that it contains milk solids, but nothing that could, at least with a straight face, be called cheese? And I don't know, I wonder. Because to my eye, the conservation elements of the current system leave a lot to be desired. Last year, before being derailed by the pandemic, ARA, my company, embarked on a review of the standards and guidelines for consultant archaeologists on behalf of the Anishinaabe Nation, formerly the Union of Ontario Indians. And in the course of that study, we spent a good deal of time bothering the good folks at the ministry with all sorts of questions about what they do and how they do it. And they are good folks, truly. You know, you can hate the food at McDonald's, but it doesn't mean that the kid who works at the counter is a bad person. And you can be unhappy with the ministry and his policies, but it doesn't mean that the people who staff the place are to blame. It's not Mordor. Anyway, among all the questions we asked the ministry, there were two in particular that we thought were simple, and these are the ones that had no available answers. The first question, how many approval authorities are there in Ontario? Because under the PPS, you know, it is approval authorities, municipalities that are charged with making sure archaeology gets done. And number two, how many approval authorities require that archaeology actually be done as part of development applications? So we're no answer to either of those. There's this old Jerry Seinfeld joke that I quite like. And he used to say that when he's engaging in small talk, he likes to stick to number questions. Number questions are the safe ones. He likes to ask people things like, how many years have you been in your job? Or how long is your boat? You know, number questions are safer than subjective questions like, how's your dad, who might be dead or dying? Or what's your wife up to, who might have taken off with your dad? And so forth. So these two questions should be safe, should have been an easy answer, but they weren't. The answer appears to be that it's nobody's job to track either. So the provincial policy statement asks that archaeology be done as part of the development process, but the government doesn't force municipalities to conform to the PPS, doesn't know how many municipalities there even are, and doesn't know whether or not they are doing the required archaeology before projects are being built. You know, that's worrisome. So again, I ask, what does conserved actually mean? Those of us who work in consulting archaeology know that there are certain municipalities where we tend to do a lot of work, the City of Toronto, Hamilton, City of London, Kitchener-Waterloo, Region of Waterloo, that sort of thing. And there are other areas where we don't do any work. I can't remember the last time I worked in Perth County, for instance. Now, maybe it's the case that there are some places with zero development going on, but maybe also they just aren't bothering to do archaeology. If we're not tracking it, and indeed, if it's no one's job to track it, how do we know? My friend Rob McDonald from ASI once told me that it is an axiom that anything you are not tracking is worse than you think. And it seems clear that there are some sites that are being, shall we say, deconserved without archaeologists ever knowing that they even existed. By not tracking this information, we've essentially bird boxed ourselves. We're reduced to hoping for the best, but without having any metrics to support that hope. How can that be sound policy? How is that conservation? So what happens in municipalities even where they do follow the PPS? Archaeology is put through a sort of a decision tree that looks something like this. You can think of it almost as being a series of sieves that get finer and finer as you go down. So we find sites, assuming the archaeology is done. If the municipality doesn't enforce the PPS, the archaeological site goes right to oblivion, destruction, removal from the landscape. But if we do find sites, we apply ministry criteria, which is to say settler government criteria, to see if they have value or not. If they pass, they're examined and measured against new and stricter criteria. At any step of the process, a site can be found to be lacking in cultural heritage value or interest and consigned to destruction. And the First Nations are legally invited to participate in the process after the first two sorts using ministry criteria have already taken place and some sites haven't made the cut. And at that point, a decision may be made to preserve sites, but in my experience, the long-term protection of archaeological sites, particularly Indigenous ones, is vanishingly rare. I've been involved in over 1,500 archaeological projects, probably 3 to 4 times that many archaeological sites. And in the last 35 years, I believe I've been a party to the long-term preservation of 3 sites. Generally speaking, when an archaeological site is found, it's more or less placed on a conveyor belt that leads almost inevitably or inexorably towards oblivion. So let's think about the term conservation. Years back, I remember Bill Fox, who I hope is here, describing archaeological sites as being analogous to rare and beautiful whales. There have been times in our history when we thought that the whales would never run out and when we hunted them to nearly to extinction. And now we know we need to take care of them because we understand that the supply isn't infinite. So taking Bill's lead, and just as a thought experiment, imagine that we protected whales or anything else in the natural world the way we protect archaeological sites. And looking at the results, could we think of it as a success in accomplishing our conservation aims? So imagine there we have our 35 beautiful whales against a sea of briny Pantone 19-4052 blue with a grade 2 joke that we used to write on a piece of paper and pass around the class, hoping some idiot would actually say it out loud so that they would get a detention. So imagine that we wanted to conserve these whales in advance of a massive expansion of our fisheries. We're a little country. And for the fishermen, the whales are a problem. They get tangled up in the nets, they do a lot of damage to equipment, they cost money. So the government sets up a system to conserve whales at the fishermen's expense. And we in this meeting here, we're working in the WRM industry, the whale resource management industry. Now there's a stage 1 study to identify whale potential in the seas, but that's just a desktop study. We won't worry about that too much. The real work starts with stage 2, which is a physical inventory of all the whales in this part of the sea. A stage 2 whale assessment. So we carry out our inventory and we find a bunch of whales. They're a very special species, this one. This is known as Fox's whale, and they're only found in seas made out of archaeological allegories and metaphors. And it looks like we have about 35 of them. Now, because conservation of the whales means increased trouble for the fishermen, the government sets a pretty high bar for which whales get conserved. They only want to protect the biggest and healthiest ones. Those are the most significant. So we apply government criteria to filter out the insignificant ones, and about half of them don't make the cut. They can be safely culled, but the rest aren't safe yet. The conservation regime says that before any whale can be protected, it must undergo further testing and pass even more stringent criteria to confirm its significance. This is called a stage 3 whale assessment. So having made it through the first round, half of the whales are now unable to meet the stage 3 significance criteria in the next round. So now we're down to 9 whales. But we know these 9, these are the really good ones. These are the ones, the significant ones, the ones worth conserving. But the fishermen aren't happy. They've paid for all these studies and they don't want to have to work around any whales. So, in sympathy for the capital expenditures taken on by the fishermen thus far, the government allows them the option of mitigating impacts to the whale population by carefully culling them and then dissecting them to thoroughly document them for scientific purposes. Some of the bones go for displays. Most sit in boxes at whale resource management firms. And in fact, they're kind of starting to pile up. In the end, less than 1 in 100 whales is actually preserved. But we do have some excellent whale skeletons that we've curated. Now, I know this metaphor isn't perfect. I know I'm being ridiculous, but I also think I'm not wrong. If we approach the conservation of the natural world the way that we've decided to conserve archaeological sites, we'd be in bigger trouble than we already are, which is pretty big. And unlike whales and American chestnuts and Blanding's turtles, there are no more pre-contact indigenous archaeological sites being made. When they're all gone, they're all gone. So for the ministry then, what is the guiding principle at work in archaeological heritage management? Is it to conserve the archaeological past? Or is the current system what you get when you want to give the appearance of conserving it while presiding over its systematic and orderly destruction? The province is all about wealth generation and supporting businesses, capital. Business wants land to develop into projects. They feel entitled to those lands. Archaeological sites don't make money. They make development more expensive, and much of the time, sadly, they lie at the unfortunate intersection of higher costs and indigenous issues. Your flock has no protection if its shepherd is a wolf. And if the province's prime directive is to support wealth and capital, and really that even on the ministry's homepage, they kind of more or less state that if the province's prime directive is to support wealth and capital, then preserving heritage, particularly somebody else's, is going to come in a distant second in its priorities. And that leads us into our next proposition, namely, it is unethical and perhaps immoral for the province to be making existential decisions about Indigenous heritage, which is to say, decisions as to whether or not Indigenous sites live or die. Now, I'm not a libertarian. I know that there are things that governments have to do by virtue of there being no higher authority in the land. I don't think I'm entitled to be a sovereign citizen. I don't want to be a freeman on the land. I know we all exist at the sufferance of others, and I believe that all of us in society owe each other respect and dignity at all times, even when we may have occasion to disagree. And I think also that while you can complain about government screw-ups, there are some things that only governments can do, unless we want to go back to the feudal era. But there are many, many good reasons for us to be uncomfortable with the province making decisions effectively without consultation with respect to which Indigenous sites get preserved and which do not. Now, I'm particularly uncomfortable with the current situation because in the process, I am appointed both colonial agent and archaeological site executioner. You know, and all that bland list of things that the province does, setting standards and enforcing the licensing regime and so on, a lot of the authority for how sites are dealt with is delegated to archaeologists like me. And there's nothing in my job that brings me more anguish than my crew presenting me with a site where the assemblage falls just short of the mark required to recommend stage 3. Nothing worse. They come to me with 8 flakes collected in a 10 by 10 area, and I beg them to go out again. And they come back and they say, we looked everywhere, we're still at 8. And the standard says you need 10 for stage 3 to recommend stage 3. And it's a situation where I never feel more alone or more dirty. If I ignore the standards and guidelines, I develop a reputation for being the archaeologist who always recommends more work in such cases and who always costs my clients more. And if that happens, I won't be allowed to be an archaeologist anymore. I'll go out of business. But if I don't, I'm the archaeologist, the person who loves archaeology, who lets archaeological sites be bulldozed. Strange. The issues are so simple, so black and white that it actually requires us to navigate a fair amount of cognitive dissonance to be comfortable with the idea that the province even should be managing Indigenous archaeological heritage. And if you think about it, the history of Ontario covers a span of at least 12,000 years, although in the last week, it's turned out maybe it's much more than that. Settlers have been here for less than 400. You know, if you put it differently, you know, if Ontario's history were represented by a 30-foot tall tree, only the top foot of it would include non-Indigenous peoples, and Canada since Confederation would comprise only the top 5.5 inches. So from a social justice perspective, why on earth would we think it's a good idea to grant these latecomers the power to make decisions about what to do with the archaeological pasts of peoples who've been around at least 30 times longer than they have? Yet we seem to be okay with it. And it's strange because it's easy enough for us to wrap our heads around the problem elsewhere. You know, the Turks occupied Greece for 400 years, and a few years before Greek independence, they sold the Parthenon marbles, maybe they sold it, to Britain's Lord Elgin. You know, the Greeks have been asking for the marbles back almost ever since, and the UK and the British Museum have refused to return them. And I think most Canadians recognize that the Greeks should have this significant cultural property back. He cut it off the front of the Parthenon, sold to him by an occupying power. We don't seem to have a problem wrapping our heads around that. And I think we find it pretty unsettling when the deliberate destruction of archaeological sites is used to erase any people from the landscape anywhere in the world. You know, it bothers us. And yet, I am personally party to such destruction almost every day. 20 years back, when the Taliban first took over in Afghanistan in 2001, I remember that they blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas, these huge giant sculptures of the Buddha that were carved into the side of mountains. It was a World Heritage Site. And at the time this happened, I was asked to offer my feelings on the issue as an archaeologist. And the first thing that went through my mind was a quote that I'd heard back in the 1980s from Sir Arthur Travers Harris. Now, he's remembered to history as Bomber Harris. He's the man who was in charge of the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command during the height of the Allied bombing campaign against Nazi Germany in the Second World War. He was sometimes known as Butcher Harris for the manner in which he seemed to indiscriminately target both military and civilian areas. And there's this story about him. Maybe it's apocryphal, maybe not, that his car was pulled over for speeding one night on his way between an airfield and London. And the constable who stopped him leaned into the window of his car and said, "You need to take care, sir. You could have killed someone." And Harris replied, "Young man, I kill thousands of people every night." And so it is with me in Indigenous archaeological sites. I make decisions every day which lead to archaeological sites being destroyed. They may be documented in the process. I may do it reluctantly. I can be sad about it. But a thing that was there for up to thousands of years before it meant me is gone afterwards. You know, we get mighty upset when archaeological sites are targeted abroad, but we don't see, or we can't see, or we refuse to see the ongoing destruction of First Nations archaeological sites here at home. For most of its history, archaeology has been something that members of the settler society did to the Indigenous past. And while the archaeologists involved may have had the best of intentions, and I'm sure they almost always did. There's many of them out there that from previous generations that I knew and loved, or know and continue to love. But for First Nations people, for Indigenous people, it was yet another instance of settlers coming to take something away from them. And that takes us to our next and final proposition, namely, that Canada is at an inflection point in its relationship with Indigenous peoples, and that archaeology will not be unaffected. I think this is as close to a no-brainer as you're apt to see this evening. If, well, the whole thing could be a no-brainer in another sense as far as you're concerned. We'll see at the end of it all. But I mean, clearly we're in a period of rapid social change with respect to our relationship with the First Nations. Social change happens in weird and unexpected ways. You know, you'd like to think that, you know, that as we learn more as a society, we act on what we learn and then change happens. You know, we identify injustice and then we take immediate steps to remedy it. But that's not actually how it happens. We members of societies in groups usually don't push for change. Typically, we're dragged into it, you know. All the themes to be found, for instance, in Black Lives Matter can be found in rap music from the late 1980s. The harassment and bullying of Black youth by police, the murder by police of unarmed suspects, everything. But white people didn't pay attention to that. They listened to the music, they bought the albums, but the white gaze, if you want to call it that, I'm paraphrasing Toni Morrison from her books, but the white gaze just seemed to slide past the uncomfortable parts. The push for reform has only captured the public imagination now because there have been so many egregious encounters that have taken place, all documented on people's cell phone cameras, that it's now impossible to either feign ignorance or to look away. The abuse scandal within the Catholic Church followed the same trajectory. It was there in French language novels from the Quiet Revolution era in Quebec. Back in the day at Wilfrid Laurier University, when I was an undergrad, you had to have a second language before you could graduate. It's hard to wrap your head around now. So I took a French literature course and I puzzled my way through French literature from the Quiet Revolution. And there were so many instances of sexually abusive priests in these books that it was almost a trope or a stereotype. It was there in films like The Bay Boy, but it still didn't click for the public until the evidence was completely overwhelming. Prior to then, it was treated almost as a joke. I'm reminded of one of the more clever parts in the Tim Burton movie Beetlejuice. And, you know, in that movie, when you died and you were a ghost, you were given the handbook for the recently deceased. And in the handbook for the recently deceased, it's written, the living usually won't see the dead. Not can't, won't. And when it comes to social justice, we in the position of privilege won't see things until we're put in a position where there's no way that we can decently look away anymore, where we can't pretend that we don't know about a thing. And so it has been when it comes to reckoning with the abuses of the Indian residential school system, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the 60s scoop, the water crisis on reserves, Indigenous poverty and homelessness, and the over-incarceration of First Nations peoples. Dr. Peter Bryce wrote about the number of children dying in residential schools in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He was fired and ignored. Maclean's magazine published, the sad death, the lonely death of Chani Wenjack in 1967, and still it didn't hit home. The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission mentioned the deaths of thousands of children when it was released in 2015. And in fact, part of that section of the report was written by the wonderful Dr. Scott Hamilton, our friend and archaeologist from Lakehead University. But nothing happened until the discovery at Kamloops. Everyone seemed shocked and outraged. People are falling all over themselves to buy orange shirts, and I'm glad that they are. But the information has been there for a long, long time. It just took a while before the white gaze was actually fixed on it. And so here we are. What happens next? As a country, we like to think of ourselves as Canada the good, right? I mean, it's Canadian patriotism is on a different register than American patriotism, but we are kind of smug. We abolished slavery early. We embraced women's suffrage, well, ahead of the Swiss anyway, certainly at about the same time as everyone else. We fought Nazis. We campaigned against apartheid. Brian Mulroney very, bravely and strongly pushed hard against that. We supported gay marriage ahead of most of the world, et cetera, et cetera. We like to think of ourselves as being on the right side of history. So because of that, I think it's been a difficult journey to grapple with the legacy of abuse that we've been handed by the people who created our country. But, we archaeologists, we come mostly from a liberal arts background. We're getting woke. We're pathfinders through this mess, right? Here in the OAS, we pored over the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we scrambled to update our Constitution and our Statement of Ethical Principles so that we could be on that right side of history. We used a lot of lofty language about our obligations to descendant communities, affirming that Indigenous communities have an inherent right to practice stewardship over their own cultural properties, acknowledging the profound relationship between those cultural properties and Indigenous peoples, regardless of ownership, asserting that we should take all reasonable efforts to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations before we, do any kind of exploration on their history and archaeology, respecting their traditions when it comes to the treatment of the dead. I mean, it's all good stuff. It's necessary stuff. And yet, though, archaeology in Ontario is fundamentally unchanged from how it was before our efforts. It's still mostly settler archaeologists working on Indigenous cultural properties and sites, using criteria set by the settler government to decide which sites are important enough to save and which sites can be safely destroyed. And frankly, it's safe to destroy virtually any of them. If you take a deep dive into who does archaeology in Ontario, you'll find that of over 800 professional and research licenses that the province has issued under the Ontario Heritage Act since 2003, only 4 of them have gone to Indigenous people. And of those, I believe only 2 are still active. And that may be because, unlike driving or shooting or hunting or boating, where you have to take a test to get a license to prove what you know, our archaeological licensing regime privileges academic qualifications over knowledge and experience. And in doing so, I believe those qualifications serve as a systemic barrier to the participation of Indigenous peoples in the management of their own heritage. At ARA, in my company, we have numerous Indigenous staff who've been with us for a decade and who've been trapped at the field technician level because they don't have a BA or an MA. And in many cases, they're the most knowledgeable archaeologists on the site, but they can't get a license. It also continues to be the case that archaeological sites can be destroyed with near impunity. No one's been charged since the 1980s, and indeed the province has been hesitant even to deal with bad actors in the archaeological profession, which is problematic because it creates a race to the bottom when it comes to fieldwork and laboratory standards. As a business person, it's extremely difficult for me to compete with someone who offers quickie assessments at bargain rates carried out by non-professionals with no messy Indigenous engagement. You know, that's where the business landscape is at. Indigenous engagement continues not to be required until the end of stage 3, even though that we're now 15 years away from the Supreme Court ruling that established an absolute duty to consult on matters which affect Indigenous traditional and treaty rights. If the right to manage your own past isn't a traditional right, I don't know what is. Some First Nations in Ontario now are notified when an archaeological permit, a PIF as we call it in the industry, is filed in their traditional and treaty territories, but it's up to them to hunt down any archaeologists that are not consulting with them. The ministry, despite being very quick to assert its right to manage the resource, seems to have very little interest in actually harnessing that right to some good purpose. And if you look at who, among all the stakeholders on any given project, has been given the most decision-making power over archaeology, the answer is not the First Nations. I place them well behind the developer, the archaeologist, and the ministry. And the very fact that the ministry has decreed that Indigenous communities don't need to be engaged until the end of stage 3, the fact that they feel they can delay this until 3/4 of the way through the process, is a testament to the low regard that the Crown clearly has for the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. They shouldn't have to go cap in hand to the ministry to ask for something that by rights they should already have, and that the ministry never had a right to take away from them. It's a strange thing to contemplate, but the idea that we have the right to explore, manage, conserve, and promote our own heritage is so central to our settler experience that we have the privilege of not ever having to think about it, ever. We don't even have to decide not to think about it, if that makes sense. It does in my head, but that's not necessarily a recommendation. Anyway, that right is a thing that's just so there, so fundamental that we don't see it or notice it. But if we were told, for instance, let's say we were told tomorrow that the United States was going to impose its laws on us and that they would be deciding how Canadian history was to be presented in museums, how it would be taught, and which Canadian archaeological sites were valuable and which could be bulldozed, I think we would take exception to that. And if we were then told that there was no legal mechanism for us to grieve the situation, then we might have just a hint of how Indigenous peoples are alienated from decision-making regarding their own history. Indigenous peoples living in Ontario are forced to accept that somebody else is going to be in charge of their heritage, even when that somebody else, the Crown, is an institution which historically has never had their back. Now, of course, all of this is of a piece with what we understand as colonialism, and which is to say, the institutionalized system that seeks to take land and resources away from Indigenous peoples, marginalize them legally, scrub away their language and culture, and then vilify them as a group to justify any resulting social problems as being somehow their own fault. At the heart of colonialism, there's a bargain. It's a bad one, mind you, but it's a bargain. It's one that says, give us your lands and resources, and in exchange, we'll take care of you. Your children, your health, your lands and resources, your water, and your heritage. But it's a contract that one party is allowed to break at will, but which binds the other party for eternity. And it's interesting. I find it interesting and maybe sad that settlers with no apparent sense of irony have for hundreds of years used expressions like Indian giver to describe people who made bargains and then reneged on them. And the thing that most sticks in my craw about the colonial system is that in order to operate, it requires my consent and the consent of people like me to work. And we have to be able to accept things happening to Indigenous peoples that we would never think of as being okay if they were happening to us. You know, we have to, for it to persist, we have to consent to the idea that the First Nations can be given poor housing and healthcare, dirty water, less funding for education, but longer jail sentences, and that their children can be more subject to seizure by the state than ours. And from that perspective, colonialism isn't just bad, you know, from a moral perspective, I should say. Colonialism isn't just bad for Indigenous peoples, it's morally bad for us. It makes hypocrites out of us. It makes a mockery of our belief in our own righteousness and our goodness. And we hear that word colonialism, and we shake our heads, and we're embarrassed about it, or we're angry about it. But there's something about it that just doesn't seem to stick. And I'm starting to wonder if it's become a safe euphemism. Colonialism. You know, it seems to be something bad, but it also seems to have some adjacency with the word colonial, which is like, you know, it's a period for architecture and furniture and history. This doesn't necessarily seem particularly evil in itself. And in being both systemic and institutional, colonialism has this comfortably impersonal quality to it. You know, culpability for it is to be found in the system, which is to say it's everybody's fault, but also nobody's. You can loudly deplore it, but without it being something you're a part of or that you benefit by. The culpability for the colonial system is so diffuse, it's so stretched across time and space, you know, amongst people through history and across the country, that it's almost impossible to pin down. You can use the word and you can remain comfortable. Now, I'm not really that smart when it comes to this stuff, like truly. Because of who I am and where I came from, I have all sorts of blind spots that are usually not revealed to me until I make some stupid gaffe, and I make them all the time. It seems like I have to learn everything the hard way. So I look for help when and where I can find it. Now, in 2019, this man, Ibram X. Kendi, published a gem of a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I looked at that book and I steadfastly refused to buy it for 2 years, thinking it was a self-help book. I was afraid it was going to be some version of Eat, Pray, Love. But it's not. What the book is amazing. It's part cultural critique and part roadmap for America to heal the fractured relationship between Black society and white society. And it's brilliant. Kendi says that historically, in the context of race, it was thought that there were 3 kinds of people. Racists, you know, very easy to define. Archie Bunker, most of your uncles, people in MAGA hats. Then there were people who were quietly not racist, but didn't rock the boat. Your mom. I can't think of anybody else other than your mom. And then there were anti-racists, who were often activists, who were often from racialized communities, and who actively fought racism, you know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and so on. 3 groups, 3 tranches of people. Kendi says that isn't correct. He says that in the 21st century, there are no blurred lines between racism, non-racism, and anti-racism, only 2 poles. Identifying oneself as not a racist, but being willing to tolerate or benefit from racist policies places one firmly on the racist pole. The middle ground doesn't exist because in its acceptance of harms to racialized groups, it never really existed at all. There is and has only ever been racism and anti-racism. As far as he's concerned, the idea of a non-racist was a comfortable euphemism designed to shield a large and privileged group from embarrassment and shame. Now I'm going to use Kendi's own words here because they're too good to paraphrase. Kendi says, racist policies have been described by other terms, institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism, for instance. But those are vaguer terms than racist policy. When I use them, I find myself having to immediately explain what they mean. Racist policy is more tangible and exacting, and more likely to be immediately understood by its victims, who may not have the benefit of extensive fluency in racial terms. Racist policy says exactly what the problem is and where the problem is. Institutional racism and structural racism and systemic racism are redundant. Racism itself is institutional, structural, and systemic. Ultimately, Kendi has no tolerance for BS, no interest in euphemisms or delivering gentle corrections. I read recently that he's been suffering for some time from stage 4 colon cancer. And I wonder, in fact, if that gives him just little patience for dancing around. I think maybe he thinks his time is limited and he doesn't want to spend it with BS. And he says that if we're going to attack a problem, we have to be very clear in our statement of what it is. Racism is institutional, structural, and systemic, just like our definition of colonialism. And maybe, just maybe, when we in this industry are talking to the wider public, maybe it's time for us to give up that word colonialism for something stronger and more uncomfortable. If you're listening to this in North America right now, and I assume most of you are, you're on treaty land and you live in a country where settlers have benefited from the lands and resources and ultimately the suffering of Indigenous peoples. I worry about the term colonialism because somehow or another, it's clearly tolerable. It has to be because we do tolerate it. We settlers have accepted it every day for hundreds of years. You know, it seems to be a system that's too big and too impersonal and perhaps too entrenched to do anything about. We talk about it the way we talk about colds and the flu. Nobody likes it, but it seems to be something that nobody can do anything about. We'd love to be rid of it, but it's hard to muster the will to do something when we simultaneously benefit from it. My family were the poorest of the poor in England and Ireland. My English family in particular came over in a thing called the Petworth Project. The Petworth Project was apparently sparked because certain English nobility were tired of seeing poor people dying by the road when they were out on their morning rides. And so they gathered up poor people from their counties and put them on boats and sent them to Canada. And that's how my family got here. And when they got here, they were given land for free that had just been surrendered by the Chippewas of the Thames. And it saved us. And in return, the Chippewas were stuck in a reserve and given bad water and had their children stolen. It wasn't a great deal. And as I say this, I realize that I probably shouldn't use the word wasn't. It's not in the past. It's still going on. If we were to take Kendi's advice, if we were to be absolutely clear in our language, we would be forced to say that the system under which Indigenous people live is racist. It's jarring for me to say it, but racist. And that archaeology in its current state is racist. And I think that word, that hard word, makes our choices in how we respond rather more stark. You know, colonialism is unfortunate and sad, but it's at a safe remove. Deriving a benefit from it as a settler, well, you're one of so very many. It has a safe, almost sanitized quality to it. But racism is both uncomfortable and intolerable. Nazi Germany was racist. South Africa under apartheid was racist. We cannot and must not be that. Being the beneficiary of racism feels just plain wrong. And in my silence or my acquiescence, I'm tattooed with that word, racist. I don't want to be that word. Ultimately, I think archaeology can't just be non-racist. I think we have to be anti-racist. We can't be a force for good unless we acknowledge and try to do something about the ways in which we've benefited from racist policies that were designed to advantage us at the expense of others. And it's tough, you know, we're neck deep in hypocrisy, and I don't know how we climb out of it. I think, frankly, that we may have to talk to some Germans, because Germany seems to be a country that is pretty good at grappling with hard truths about the past. I don't know. But here we are at an important inflection point in the development of our society, and we seem to be dancing on the razor's edge. Our choices seem to be either doubling down on being colonizers and racists, which in the case of, you know, which we're seeing in the case of the alt-right and the angry populist right, the MAGA crowd in the States, you know, they're choosing to go all in on that. And it seems to be that either we do that or we become actively anti-racist and try to lend a hand in building a just society where everyone is afforded equal dignity and respect. It's a weird thing. You know, I got into archaeology because I was this strange kid with a ton of anxiety. I had severe OCD, and I had a lot of really noticeable and embarrassing tics as a kid. You know, and that boy that I was had this dream where I would become an archaeologist and I would work alone in a basement somewhere, just me and some old boxes full of ancient things. And I thought that archaeology was a great way to hide from the world. And yet here we are, front and center in some of the most important discussions that are taking place regarding what sort of country we want to have. And we have skills and knowledge that are useful in those debates. I think it likely goes against lots of our natures, most of our natures, to make a ruckus. You know, we never signed up for that, but I'm not sure we have the luxury of being quiet anymore. So it's really all I've got to say. I'm going to leave you with a piece of art. I'm hoping that it'll make the talk seem a little more highbrow or profound, but really I just don't know how to end the talk, particularly a serious one like this. This painting is a favorite of mine. It's called The Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and it's from 1562, which was a period when Europe was reeling from the social upheaval and terror caused by the plague. It was a time a little bit like now. It's a painting that was one of Hemingway's favorites. In it, if you look at it, you see the forces of death have humanity at bay. We're completely surrounded. Bodies are piled everywhere. Gruesome things are happening. People are being broken on wheels. People are being scavenged by dogs. Defeat seems imminent. And yet, when you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see one man who, taking it all in, walks forward and draws his sword. And that's a great metaphor as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
I'm taking a big deep breath right now, Paul, and saying, thank you. You should take a deep breath too.
I'm going to take a drink of Diet Coke.
Well, I'm having a mug full of something. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Tom Moore, our vice president, to thank you. And then I want to open this up for discussion because I think it's very important that we acknowledge what you've said tonight. Now, anyone who is on the screen has to unmute themselves. But first, Tom.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. You know, it's funny, you know, Cheryl, with your internet, you know, sometimes it gives out on you. So this time I actually prepared a little something to say in case I had to introduce Paul. And the word that was that just kept coming back to me, Paul, was, you know, you're a mensch, right? And thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to send you as a little thank you, one of our famous highly coveted coffee mugs, and our thanks.
Well, you're very
It's
welcome.
greatly appreciated.
Thank you. So I would invite Paul, you've said so much, but we all needed to hear this. And I would invite anyone who wants to ask you questions to unmute themselves and join the conversation.